Alright, welcome to this video. Today we're going to be going over block printing and some of the basics of this process. We're not going to go too much into detail on it because there's a lot more that I'm going to show you later on. Today we're going to go over the tools, some of the materials, and then why we work with this material, as well as some of the basic carving techniques involved with this. Now, as for the tools, it's a very small setup. You don't need to have huge presses with this one, and it's probably why I like this process so much. It's probably one of my more favorite methods of printmaking, other than monoprints, because I can do that pretty much anywhere. But with this one, I don't need a whole lot. As you can notice, I'm only using a couple tools here. There's only one that I'm not using at the that I'm not showing at the moment, and that's a Baron, and that's just to burnish the backside of it. And I use that with some of my more rigid plates or things where I'm using much thinner medium on top of here. But you can also use like spoons and stuff like that. As for the types of materials, there's no limit to what you can use. You can use linoleum, and you usually see this guy right here, either like this, where it's got the canvas backer and then the soft linoleum. This is a battleship gray. You might also see it in a terracotta color. It's a little on the rigid side. I usually like the terracotta if I'm doing something that needs to be a little bit on the softer side. But this is a rigider, a little bit more of a rigid material than some of the other ones, but it holds a cleaner edge. You might also see it mounted to a block, piece of wood of some sort, plywood, natural wood, etc. Fantastic material to work with. This is the more traditional way of seeing it. You might find this in various art catalogs. This one is one of the newer materials. This has been out for about the past 15 years or so. It's a soft carving block. You might also see it as a speed block or a speed carving block, or there's so many different names of them. It's basically a firm rubber that is easy to carve. And this block right here is probably 10 years old now. So it shows you how long this stuff holds up and how rigid this is. And this used to be from a much larger plate, and I've cut it down for various different uses so I can have a wood grain the way I wanted it to. So I use it in any number of sizes. I don't see them too huge of a thing, but for small works, they're fantastic. You can also use regular wood. Birch plywood is good. Masonite is good. MDF is good. The idea behind block printing is that you're carving away and using a subtractive method to the process. So anything you can use in that vein is fantastic for that. We'll use this block today. For carving, there's only a couple tools that I ever really use, and that's usually going to be your chisel and then some sort of cutting knife. You can use an X-Acto. X-Actos are fantastic. The only difference between an X-Acto and, say, like a box cutter is the angle in which you can cut things. And this is a good example of that. If I'm working straight up, and if I need to control a straight line, using a box cutter or some sort of zip blade is a little bit more effective, for the simple fact that you're working at a pulling motion at a 45-degree angle, so versus as a straight up and down, trying to hold that as a straight line. And that's usually done, as part of my example in another video that I was working with somebody. Drawing a straight line is, hard unless you can drag it straight. These lines will always be a little bit more wavy than the other ones, so you get a little bit more control if you can hold something at an angle and drag and pull backwards with you. Other than that, there are these guys, and they make numerous tools. You can use regular wood carving tools, but I noticed that the shanks are much thicker on them than these guys right here. So if you can find one that has a nice thin shank of metal versus the thick ones you usually see, which have to hold up to intense gouging in wood and being able to not snap under a bunch of the grain, uh, then I would use those guys because the edges hold up far better than this stuff right here. This one, on the other hand, uh, comes in numerous different angles. I've seen them in everything from small little chisel grooves to big U shapes to ones where the straight blade here, which is pretty much I intended to be the same thing as the box cutter over there. And I've even seen some where they're sort of like U-shaped, and then the cutting blade is on the inside. They're apparently a safety blade, so as opposed to being able to work in a gouging method and having the potential for zipping your tool into your finger, which I've never done before, they are meant to be a pulling method. So no matter what, it's a little bit harder to get it because of the where the blade is placed and the process in which it's done. It's usually meant for like kids in middle school and stuff like that, or people who are worried about, you know, accidentally cutting themselves. That being said, these tools are pretty much straightforward. When we go to print, we'll need to use some sort of ink. Speedball has a nice acrylic ink, but it dries exceedingly fast. It's water based and it's fantastic. It has good ink coverage, but in a drier area like here, where we're at, you could literally get one coat on your plate and then have to clean it all off again because wash it all off because it has already started to cure. There is a brand called, and don't get me wrong that I don't know exactly how to pronounce this. It's either Aqua or Akua. I've heard it pronounced both ways. It is spelled A-K-U-A, and if I find my container somewhere, I'll probably use it in a later video. It is a soy-based water-soluble ink. So it is a combination of standard traditional printmaking inks and a water-soluble ink. And it has a length of work time that is fantastic, and it covers great. The only difference is that it's a little bit harder to get because it's not like Speedball, who you can get that down at your local craft store if you need to, if you're in a pinch. The next thing is also a brayer, and I can't stress this enough. I probably use this in more varied situations than anything else. You can use this to print with when you're all done. If you have multiples, you can use this for laying down nice even coverages of paper and collages, so you're not having to worry about burnishing. It's good for putting creases in folded work from anywhere from metal to anything else because it's got a softer edge, but you can also apply direct pressure to that edge. Fantastic tool, and probably a must-have in any studio situation. And I mean, there's not much more I can say about that. You grab a couple of them. They range for anywhere from inexpensive like this one to, oh man, upwards of like $45 for ones that are chemical resistant and completely Teflon based, to different durometers for hardness. I mean, they're just out there. Fantastic tool though, so pick that up. Now let's talk about some technique. The process in which we're going to work is different than all the other ones because, as opposed to normal printing processes, which usually is an additive method of building up an image, this is a subtractive method. So you will end up removing the parts that you don't want printed. So you're working in reverse. And the ink itself will sit on top of that plate and then get transferred to the paper with equal pressure. So you end up with a nice clean image, but it's a different process than a lot of the other ones. The closest one would probably be lithography, but it's still using an additive method and then finally goes through this whole process. And you can see that cleanly right here, and that's why I keep this guy around for my instructionals, is because you can see the cutout grooves, and you see where the ink over the course of years has built up over on it and stained it. And but it's a fantastic process where you can see how that that carving process works and what you end up with as a whole. All right, so let's get started on some image making. This is just a small little sample image, and I'm probably going to put something in the corners here. And we'll cover some of the basic line works, how to carve out all these different aspects, and then some of the design elements that you can use and how you can visualize them. So, very simple process. I'm going to use my small fine chisel here because I usually want to make sure you have a small fine tip for anything that's line work. Now there's two distinct lines you can make, and there's a couple different ways of achieving different line works. Now the cutting process is usually going to be a forwards process, so make sure you're always bracing your work. Whether you use like one of those table braces, and you might see those guys in some of the stores, or how to make a table brace, something where you push up against this, or if you're holding it, and this is why they usually have safety edges for that. Make sure you're always pushing against a braced work because you don't want to skitter your work across the floor, the table. Now, just because I got this nice clean line that I had to make, a lot of times you can just slowly work and press your work. If you're working with linoleum or some older materials, they tend to flake a little bit more. And almost everything you do is going to be a scooping method. Now, if you do have a long one that you need to have straight, you can use a sort of a rocking motion, and this is good for linoleum because you can get into these areas and then sort of wiggle your work around if you need to. You can get shaky lines and do your stuff, but you're staying at the same depth. What you're aiming for is achieving movement without working too hard. Now, if you notice, I'm twisting my work while keeping my tool pretty much the same, because you don't want to be janking your hand around, because you lose strength and control. So if at any given point in time you can move your work, especially on smaller works, versus your tool, all the better. So, with that being said, you can see the nice deep gouge that I'm putting through here. There's some jaggedness across the edge of this tip here, and I've got straight lines here. Now the other way is to use a chipping method, where you can start to build up the area by chipping out sections. And I'll be doing that in the background a lot, and that's fantastic because you can get direction, you can get movement, you can get severity to it, but it also lets you get some negative space color in there without having solid spots. And so now if you notice, I got this guy sitting up here that came straight up to this edge, and then you can come straight back around and then pierce into it, and you can get it to pop out. You can also, when you come up to an edge, have one side go that way, and then you can come through and cut through to the back side of it, and you end up with a nice deep corner. And of course, anytime you have line work, so for example, this little starburst type thing, if I want to keep that as a line, I actually have to cut either side of how thick I need that to be. So keep that in mind when you're working on artwork. You don't want to make things too thin because they have to eventually get printed. And the thinnest parts will be the parts that will degrade over time with your work. Now see, I got this little corner thing that's lifting up. So the beak is a good outline image area. Right there. And back again. Now, I will do the same wiggle motion, getting my dirty edge, which is good if you need rough textures on your stuff. Alright, now you might be saying, this is sometimes a little hard to tell what I'm doing. How do I see my image? That's why I usually keep around some sort of fat Sharpie or something like that. Something I can clean off with like rubbing alcohol later on. Because it lets me pre-proof my image of where I want everything to be. Plus I can carve through this. So if I'm working with texture and I need to make sure I got the right texture coverage, this is the perfect way of doing it. I don't use this method too often because this was one way where I did it where I used like a light blue and then I used like a black on top of here, and they will stain these type of blocks here. Linoleum and wood, same thing. But you can see how already I'm getting some good coverage here. My line work is nice and clean in the edges. I've got consistent line work. I've got some dappling on the edge here. It gives me some movement. And I'll cover the edge of this guy real quick. And so if I need this to look the way it needs to be, like I said, you can carve through. And this is a lot of reverse cutting. And you can rotate into the edges. Now, up in this area is too tight for me to get my tool in there properly. So this is where a good cutting edge will land in here. Because I can pierce into that area really fast and lift that area out. So I can get nice, clean, small, tight lines. And that's the basics of carving. The rest of it is all just taking your time, making sure you have a good, clean image to work from, and then taking your time. On the next one, I'll probably have this guy all carved out, and I'll show you guys how to print it. And then the following video will probably be how to work with a reduction print, where you work with one block, but you get multiple colors out of it by taking it and carving down more and more with each progressive print to build up a multicolor image. So if you guys have any questions or comments, let me know in the sections below. And otherwise, enjoy the video and make some art.